Hello, I'm Steve Sedgwick and welcome to CNBC's Internet of Things Powering the Digital Economy debate. Our conversation today is all about the power of partnerships for a net zero future. A range of key talking points will be addressed, including how, despite seeing growing commitments from key carbon emitting nations and companies from across the world to reach net zero by 2050, few can achieve deep decarbonisation on their own. Collective action is required. We will explore the essential role which partnerships play when it comes to unlocking the potential of climate-friendly solutions. We'll discuss the success of partnerships up to now and which type are key for a more sustainable future. And crucially, where do we need to see greater cooperation if we are to succeed and meet our net zero goals? I'm going to be joined a little later on by a panel of leading industry figures to debate these topics. But first, I'm joined by the chairman and CEO of Schneider Electric, Jean-Pascal Tricoire, for a brief discussion that will set the scene for our debate. Jean-Pascal, absolutely fantastic to catch up with you yet again. It's 6 years now since you and I were at Le Bourget in Paris, and one of the key factors needed in order to get success in attaining the Paris goals is collaboration between governments and businesses, between businesses and businesses, the financial community, and indeed society at large. How would you judge the success of that collaboration in the last 6 years?
Look, if we look what the report of the IPCC has published, clearly the window of time is closing and we are nowhere where we should be. Our own estimation, and we speak about collaboration with other companies and institutions, on working on scenario like the Energy Transition Committee or within the UN Global Compact. And we see that we should be doing today 3 to 5 times more than what we are doing. It's about focusing on the thing that can be done now, on realizing that the real timeline is not 2040, 2050, but 2030, because if we don't act in the next decade, it will be seriously too late.
And yet, if I may say so, Schneider Electric hasn't waited for other people to collaborate with. You've gone ahead. In fact, that's what's made the company one of the greenest on the planet by various measures. Are others moving ahead on their own fast enough, or are they just waiting for someone to show them the way?
Today, if you look at the top 2,000 companies, only 20% have taken objectives toward net zero or carbon neutrality. So we are really far away from having a global and complete mobilization. We are just at the beginning. But one thing that we should all realize when we speak about collaboration is that going towards carbon neutrality is a teamwork. So it's about collaborating between different stakeholders to make it possible. Take the example of Schneider, our company. 90% of the carbon footprint is with our suppliers. We just signed an agreement with our top strategic suppliers to help them reduce their carbon emission by 50% in the next coming 5 years. And what you're going to see is more and more coalitions, because if one company wants to progress, they have to take along a lot of other companies, suppliers and customers, upstream and downstream.
What are the limitations to collaboration? You have a company which has an awful lot of IP, has a lot of intellectual property that it's perhaps difficult to share with all kinds of people. So you can only go down a certain path before you do detriment to your business profile going forward by extensive collaboration. That's got to be a barrier somewhere down the line, hasn't it?
I think the biggest barrier you see today is thinking the old way. If you summarize, the problem is now well stated. We know that all of our companies will have to move. Technologies do exist. They just require to think differently and to approach the subject of constructions, projects, installations, and operations in a different manner. So what we need to do, and this is what we are actively doing, is collaborating together within the whole value chain on making sure that all of us rethink the way we design, the way we build, the way we operate to make it in a sustainable manner.
And yet, all kinds of areas of collaboration, climate change consultation, renewable energy procurement, ESG reporting, no problems there, sharing that with partners along the way.
The first thing that we do is to help our customers strategize and understand their impact on their problem. So it's about digital measurement of everything which is happening, and then you can formulate a strategy and deploy that strategy. So I just think that, by the way, it's very creative of value. I take the example of Schneider. It has been a massive generator of new things that we are not doing before. And I believe that many industries will be regenerated by this new approach of doing things.
How reliable are partners are governments? They've got so many issues they need to worry about. They've got electoral cycles. We saw in the US the pulling out of the COP and then coming back into it again as well. You've got to move ahead regardless of collaboration with governments, haven't we?
The collaboration with government is also crucial. Where government can help is really by setting standards which at minimum are not in the middle of the way, like, for instance, subsidizing fossil fuels doesn't help. Putting the subsidies to low carbon energy or energy efficiency does help. And also working in a close manner with industry to understand, well, what are the new innovations and the technologies which are available on the market, putting together the right education programs so that people are able to design, build, operate in the right manner, and then make sure that a large part of every country infrastructure, which is a state-owned infrastructure, buildings, roads, cities, is leading the way by taking measures to become greener and smarter.
I just realised in all our conversations today about collaboration and about governments, we've been talking about developed nations and sophisticated companies and countries who are very sophisticated and a long way down the road like China. You and I both know one of the big problems at Le Bourget in COP21 was actually the developing nations. So what about us partnering more effectively with developing nations?
The first duty we have, we speak a lot about climate change, but the first duty we have is to make sure that the 1 billion of people who don't have access to energy on the planet, on the 2 billion, including the first 1 billion who don't have a reliable access to energy on the planet, do get it. On same thing for digital, because energy is your passport to a decent life, and digital your passport to economic inclusion on education. But this has to be integrated in the priorities of Glasgow.
You've gone a long way on your own journey as a person and as a company as well. You have become, as I say, one of the greenest companies on the planet as well. What's the most important thing you have to do in terms of collaborating with others to go to the next level?
Well, make sure that we position ourselves in the right level of the value chain so that we bring value to the other actors and we build on the value of other actors. So make sure that we don't redevelop what is existing, and make sure that we use our unique positioning so that we can provide solutions which are unique and easy to implement and fast to implement to our customers.
Sounds good to me. Jean-Pascal, lovely to speak to you as ever. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Steve.
Our panellists are just about to join me, but before I introduce today's guests, here's a short film to add some context and frame the debate.
As we count down to COP26, the stakes could not be higher. Politicians, CEOs and activists are gearing up to meet at the UN's climate summit in Glasgow, Scotland. There they will try to make new commitments to goals made under the 2015 Paris Agreement, recommitting to limiting global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius to help avoid catastrophic consequences.
A lot of meaningful action is taking place. The problem is that it's 5 to 10 years later than it should have occurred, but it's still good news.
The journey towards carbon neutrality will be challenging and one that necessitates a simple solution. We must work together to help save our planet.
On the transition side, it's not going to be something that is solved overnight with the flip of a switch. Companies and countries need plans and setting robust interim targets to check in on the progress of that. It's really about taking that action now.
Partnerships are growing across the globe. Governments and organisations are coming together to create innovative solutions that will help reduce CO2 emissions. Collaborations are also flourishing on an industry level across different sectors as multinationals, SMEs and startups work together towards the same goal. In April, the United Nations launched the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which brings together 55 financial institutions with combined assets of over $37 trillion to accelerate decarbonisation strategies through their lending and investment portfolios.
No one country, no one organisation can solve this themselves. We have to work in collaboration and partnership. So I think net zero is a really important target, but also importantly is financing the transition to a low carbon economy.
At the heart of the fight against climate change is renewable energy. Thanks to collaborations across the energy sector, switching from fossil fuels to wind power, solar and biofuels is becoming easier, while developed and developing countries are often working side by side to support each other in the creation and provision of clean energy. As climate change remains the most pressing economic and environmental change globally, how can private and public partnerships help us reach our net zero goals? Can we agree a best practice that will help us share expertise and technologies to innovate further and deliver a cleaner, more sustainable future? Welcome to CNBC's IOT, Powering the Digital Economy debate, as we focus on the power of partnerships for a net zero future.
Joining me is Sanda Ojiambo, who is the CEO and Executive Director of the United Nations Global Compact. Thierry Delaporte is the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Wipro. And Lord Adair Turner, Chair of the Energy Transitions Commission and Senior Fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Thank you all for joining me. Sanda, if I may start off with you. I was speaking to Christiana Figueres at COP21 and I said, how do you possibly get a deal of so many disparate parties, how many different interests are throwing their hat into the ring? How do you do it? She said, well, it's like herding cats. So, Sanda, with that in mind, you have an enormous organisation, 13,000 companies plus, 160 countries represented. How do you herd those cats?
Right, thanks. And it's a great question. I mean, the thing is that to solve the crisis at hand, you do need a large number of companies. You do need momentum. I mean, you do need commitment. And so I fully agree. I mean, what we do need to do is point people towards a unified direction. And actually, the Sustainable Development Goals provide that perfect framework for development. But right now, I think the climate crisis is one thing that really unites us around a common issue and a common issue that we must bring together. I think what excites me most, above and beyond the membership of the Global Compact is the clarity of the fact that to address the climate crisis, you do need partnership between government, between the private sector, civil society, and it really does have to be a multi-stakeholder, multilateral response. So as long as we are all facing in the right direction with the problem at the center, I think we've taken one step towards the progress that we need to make.
My concern is, though, there are so many enormous issues. You mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. You have 10 principles, including human rights, labour, anti-corruption, and of course the environment is a huge part of that as well. How on earth do you get companies to prioritise one or other of these issues? I mean, one, for us now, we may say environment is the preeminent issue, but it must be very, very difficult to get the companies on some form of accord on this whole host of issues.
Well, we don't really ask for alignment across a whole host of issues. What we do say at the Global Compact is embrace the 10 principles as being fundamental for responsible business. But in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, it's really a question of materiality. I mean, if you're sitting in an extractive industry, what is more material to you is suddenly very different from if you're in the banking industry or in the hospitality industry. So it then becomes a matter of materiality and where you need to prioritize and have the most impact. But if I go to the fundamentals, to our principles, we believe that embracing the principles that we have on human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption just make for better business. And we're a business organization. So if we can give you the toolkit and the mindset to have a longer term sustainable business, then we'll do that.
Indeed. And Lord Adair Turner, this is something which, of course, you've been looking at as well. Your latest report from the ETC as well is talking about the importance of urgency. Has there been a lack of urgency up till now? Because from 2015 Le Bourget to Glasgow 2021, some of the problems have been the lack of cohesion, the lack of collaboration in getting the financing forward. Where can we go next with this that actually is going to make a more meaningful and swift difference?
Well, I think the good news is that really over the last 2 years, there has been a positive ambition loop, as what some people call it, a self-reinforcing cycle between what governments are saying and what the private sector is saying. You've had private sector companies increasingly realizing that with the technologies available, they can commit to get to net zero emissions by mid-century. That giving governments confidence that they can set that target, and that making it non-negotiable for businesses to then come in line with that target. And if I think of, 3 years ago, almost none of the really tricky sectors of the economy, like shipping or aviation or steel, had made commitments to be net zero by 2050. But I can tell you the Global Concrete and Cement Association is going to set out a pathway to net zero by 2050. So is the Global Net Zero Steel Initiative. We saw IATA, the International Association of the Airlines, committing to net zero. That is all positive, and it's reflected in very strong government commitments as well. And I don't think it's just a greenwash. I think these really make a difference. But what we now need to do is take those commitments to get to net zero by 2050 and say, okay, if we're going to get there, we have to do things in the 2030s to be on the path to that. And we've got to actually reduce emissions by about 40% in the 2030s, as well as getting to net zero.
Lord Turner, what's got in the way of collaboration? What has got in the way of attaining those targets you meant about, how we've fallen short of those targets?
You need a collaboration between both governments and business. And it's a continual iterative process. It needs to involve both strong action by governments and strong action by the private sector, including by private sector finance, asset managers, banks, etc.
I'll come back to what strong actions means and the role of regulation in a short while, but let me get to Thierry Delaporte as well. Thierry, you launched your own Transform to Net Zero last year, but you are also a founding member of the Transform to Net Zero Coalition. Just explain to us how important it is to have a coalition moving forward together rather than companies such as Wipro doing it on their own.
I think it's exactly a reflection of the fact that, we were going to be committing to improvements over the years, but not necessarily putting the actions in place collectively. And the reality is that no single company can address the climate crisis alone. Adair said it, and I think it's very clear that, we've been talking about it. We've been working on different actions with this perspective to be neutral somewhere 10, 15 years away. And then year after years, we've seen the gap increasing. And the reality is that to really have a big impact and to really drive, real results to net zero, we need to standardize net zero approach to ensure the progress is made efficiently and effectively. It must be, substantially easier for companies of all sizes, all sectors across the globe to also move towards achieving a net zero future. So the connection with, other companies, the ecosystem, the communication and the cooperation with administrations in the respective countries is absolutely essential for us to drive, substantial results.
Thierry, are you sometimes confused by the amount of bodies and regulation and standards that people are putting forward? I mean, this is perhaps one of the big goals, perhaps, that COP26 can give us, that we have more standardized regulation, more standardized goals. I'll come back to Sanda on this in a few moments' time, but as a company, would that be useful if you had one or two sets of standards which you were working towards?
Well, that's exactly the point. The answer is yes, Steve. The reason for the creation of Transform to Net Zero Coalition was precisely to engage with policymakers and policies that are really needed to incentivize zero carbon investment and really stimulate greater action and more effective climate risk management across the world. A company like Wipro is operating in 65 countries around the world. And every time, we need to comply and adapt to, local situations. So the more alignment across the world is, the better it will be for us to drive effective results.
Sanda, let me bring you in on this as well, because the UNGC has got its own offering here, which is the Science-Based Targets Initiative as well. Tell me a little bit about it and why this is so important for collaboration and partnerships.
for us, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI as we call it, is really, I think, testament of a remarkable partnership based on trust that really allows us to leverage the strengths of four organizations that have come together, the UN Global Compact, the CDP, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. I mean, for us, we founded in 2015, and to date, we have over 1,800 leading companies that have been setting emissions reduction targets in line with the latest climate science advanced by the SBTI. And, we did a progress report in the year 2020 that demonstrated that companies that do have science-based targets in place have reduced their combined emissions by 25% since 2015. And I think it's been really important to demonstrate that with science-based targets, progress has happened. For us, it's important to have a standard, and it's important to not only raise the ambition, but make sure that actions are grounded in science and we're able to track and measure that progress.
Adair, does that need to be backed up by strong regulation, though, if companies and countries do not attain those minimum standards?
I think there's a big role to be played by voluntarily made or encouraged private sector commitments. And those, in some cases, it's people sign up to science-based targets. Sometimes people sign up to EV100 or RE100. They'll only buy electric vehicles, or they'll only buy renewable energy. Those are powerful mechanisms, and they've been powerful frameworks for motivating action by businesses. But we can't just leave it to the private sector. You also need the public sector to come in, both encouraging that and behinding it, to create the enabling conditions. Let me give you an example. Let's take cement. The fact is that cement is one of those areas of the economy where decarbonizing is not going to be costless. There are some areas where new technology will enable us to decarbonize the economy at no economic cost. The point about cement is the very chemical process of producing cement produces CO2. Therefore, it's one of the technologies, one of the areas where we will definitely need carbon capture and storage, and it will add to the cost. And so here's the challenge for a cement company which wants to do the right thing and wants to head to net zero. Their cement, however hard they try, is going to be more expensive. So at some stage, you do need the public authority to come in either with a regulation, a public procurement requirement, which says we will only allow zero carbon cement, or a carbon tax. So yes, we can do a lot through private initiative, but it has to be supported by hard measures, by hard rules, by carbon prices and regulations. We must not fool ourselves that private sector action alone can get us there.
And Thierry, just on that point, you mentioned earlier you're in 60 plus countries as well, having 60 plus different parts of regulation, 60 plus different standards as well. Getting some form of uniform regulation would make life so much easier for companies to actually roll out better standards and better initiatives to get to net zero.
Absolutely, Steve. Absolutely. There's no question that, the way we are working with the ecosystem to drive actions, is critical. And I don't want to only focus on, local regulations. It is, I think we've said it, Adair and Sanda have talked about it. The entire ecosystem is also around, who we're working with, in the way our procurement teams choose lower carbon suppliers and products, in the way our finance department established low carbon, climate risk-based criteria for the deployment of capital, in the way marketing campaigns show consumers how to live net zero lives. Working with our partners to define new travel policies to reduce, emission. All those actions, if run independently, and in particular from one country to another, are not driving results. The necessity to constantly align with this ecosystem is is a reality. And so that's what we are doing. That's obviously what we are doing in the Transform to Net Zero coalition. It's really by working with the other partners in this coalition, we are really working along all these lines, trying to see how we can address and really get measurable targets and drive the results around, against these targets, not with a perspective of 10 years, but really more 2 to 3 years.
So with that in mind, Adair, come in on this.
Yeah, look, I wanted to come in on this thing about standardization of regulation, because I think we have to be, realistic. There's some areas where you're not going to get full regulation, right? So how buildings are designed, what are health and safety rules on building design? What are the rules on public procurement? I mean, those are going to be different in India and the US. There are some things, such as the built environment, which often have inherently local characteristics. But what we have to try to do is work out where we need an element of international coordination and get it in those areas. So in the international shipping and aviation areas, you need an element of standardization and a global approach. Somebody who is going to invest in a new container ship, which burns hydrogen, ammonia, not heavy fuel oil, is going to have to know that when they go to Singapore or Dubai or Rotterdam, there is a facility to take on board ammonia of a certain quality. And that sort of stuff requires some coordination. And the good news is that in aviation and shipping, we actually have international regulatory authorities, International Maritime Organization, ICAO, who can provide that regulation. We then have some other areas like steel, where if we have very different carbon prices in different parts of the world, we will have real problems about international competitiveness. One response to that is the European Union's idea of what's called a border carbon adjustment. But a better solution would be to get broadly similar carbon prices, not necessarily across the whole of the economy. We don't need it across the whole of the economy, but across those bits of the economy which are internationally traded. We're never going to have global regulation, but we got to pick off the things where there's a big benefit from some degree of global coordination.
And on the areas where we can get some form of global collaboration and cooperation at COP26, Sanda, the point I was going to ask you, and I'll make the point again now, are the policymakers framing the debate correctly? Are they on one page? Do you believe that the debate globally is being framed in the right way, Sanda?
I think what's clear is there's a crisis. Some lens of focus will go on to the mitigation piece and, the big role that big industry has to play and pushing forward on the 1.5 target. Other parts of the world are coming at this around what's the financing priority and what's really important there. Others are looking at the adaptation piece. So I don't think there's a unified angle to which this argument can really approach, because it really depends on what direction, governments and policymakers are coming at this at. So, and I think that's the very essence of the COP, is to really see how you can then, bring together the best of the positions for a solution that works best for mankind. But it is an evolving situation. I think the climate crisis plays out very differently in different parts of the world. But, underpinning most of it, I think for me, the three key issues: one is the urgency, the second is the financing that is required, and the third is really the multi-stakeholder and multilateral partnerships that are required. And so I don't know that there's necessarily a one-size-fits-all. The urgency and the science is there. The approaches, I think, is what needs to fit into this umbrella.
Let me pick up on one of those key points. We've discussed a little bit the urgency, but the financing is absolutely key. If ever there was an area where the collaboration was intended, but it didn't really happen to the degree that we needed it to, was on the $100 billion per year going from developed world to emerging as well. Financing is key. Adair, have you just come back on this, and then I'll get Thierry in on it as well. But you think the numbers are absolutely staggering that we need to find? This is going to need huge degrees of collaboration to find, what is it, $1.5 to $2 trillion per annum to make this transition successful, Adair?
I think the crucial thing on finance is to break it down into different categories, some of which are private, some of which are public, and some of which are private-public cooperation, right? So a lot of this finance, a lot of that 1.5 trillion will happen, done by the private sector, as long as the regulations and the carbon prices and the electricity market structures are there. At the other end, I think you have to realize that there are some things which are not finance in the sense of debt and equity finance. They are grants, they are subsidies, and there may have to be a flow of money from rich developed countries to help them do that. There are things which will cost poorer countries some money and richer countries will have to pay. So I think we have to break down the total investment need into a large bit which the private sector can do for itself, a relatively small bit which is fundamentally about income transfers and subsidies, but we better recognize where that's needed, and then a significant slice in the middle, which is all about true cooperation between private and public sectors to deliver finance to the developing world at a lower cost of capital than it would otherwise be.
Thierry, your company spans developed, emerging, and has done so extraordinarily successful. But what about the profitability going forward, given everything that Sanda and Adair have just mentioned as well? Is profitability going to be impacted? Are shareholders going to have to accept lower profits given this vast amount of money that needs to be used to finance this transfer? And also, are shareholders just going to have to use to the fact that they are now going to be stakeholders rather than just shareholders that they have been?
There is no doubt that there is a need to invest into transforming the way we are working. It goes beyond the question of financing itself. If I look at the corporate world, my conviction is that if, as leaders of this organization, we are not addressing this issue and playing our own role, we will lose the market. And so it will have a cost as well for the shareholders. Our companies will just no longer exist. I'm convinced at the speed the world is changing today, I'm convinced that the company who doesn't understand the role he has to play to drive rapid, significant results will be a company that talent will no longer want to join in some years from now, and that will have a massive cost. And so at the end of the day, there's no question about, are we ready to finance it? There's no other option than, going through this transition seriously, right? Not achieving net zero by 2050 is quite simply not an option. So we have to drive it. The cost of not investing in it now will be much bigger for the company and for its brand.
Thank you, Thierry. I'm at pains to note that we've talked a lot about companies to companies, the old B2B. We've talked about shareholders and investors. We've also talked about governments and regulators, but we haven't, of course, talked about the collaboration needed with our own employees of companies as well, with society as a whole, with the consumers as well. So those are very important collaborations that need to be noted as well. But I've got one final round of questions for you all. Where do we really need to make the most ground? Sanda, let me start off with you. Where is the greatest challenge in getting further meaningful collaboration so that we can actually make the transition to net zero?
My view would be getting the financing, the right type of financing at the right mix and for the right priorities on the table. I think commitments are great, but we won't be able to move forward with it unless you get the right mix of financing for action.
And for you, Adair, as well, in terms of the biggest challenge for collaboration going forward from you?
I think it is actually things to do with the agriculture, food and land use area. I'm an optimist that we will drive the decarbonisation of the whole of the energy, building, industry and transport sector. Where I think I am not confident is that we know how to stop the destruction of our great tropical rainforests and other loss of biodiversity. I'm not confident that we know how to solve those problems while also dealing with the livelihoods of the people who depend on that for economic livelihood. I think that's where we need a lot of international cooperation and a lot of international finance, because the technology isn't just going to come to our rescue in the same way that it will, a bit late, but eventually will come to our rescue in the electricity system and the transport system.
And Thierry, you are on your path as well to net zero over at Wipro. The greatest challenge for business, acting in a collaborative way.
I would say two more things, along the lines of our discussion today. I would say, we must be pragmatic. And being pragmatic means, not going into complex political controversies, but really focus on, areas where we can have an impact now, leveraging the ecosystem and working with all the different components. And the second thing is, drive results now. Don't look at 2040, just look at 2021 and 2022, and then 2023 maybe. But just be real about, actions and improvements now, and just focus on those actions.
So just to summarize, I think there's a lot of hope. I think there's a lot of need for urgency. And from Thierry at the end there as well, don't just think about the distant goals on the horizon, think about the smaller steps in the very short term. Absolutely important in order that we can grow collaboration, grow partnerships, especially in this pivotal time ahead of COP26. I want to thank our panelists today, Sanda Ojiambo, who is the CEO and Executive Director of the United Nations Global Compact, Thierry Delaporte, who is the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Wipro, and of course Lord Adair Turner, Chair of the Energy Transitions Commission and Senior Fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Thank you very much again for all your insights and what I believe has been an extraordinary look into the power of partnerships for a net zero future.